The anthropocentric metaphysical baggage is at profound odds with the open-minded bravery of admitting that one can't know things in themselves, only phenomena. So what happens when you release the copyright control? Underneath the human-flavored kitchen sink drama of deciding and lights and refrigerator is a deep fact about things, which Derrida calls the arrivant, or I call the strange stranger, or Graham Harman calls objects. Although we can't know what is on or not in the fridge, until we've opened it, there is a fridge. It isn't a polar bear. It isn't a cloud. It's a fridge. Yet the essence of the fridge is weirdly withdrawn. The object or strange stranger has an absolute specificity, a unicity. It is just this thing, this tree, this refrigerator. But a strange not yet sucks its being into a radically unknowable future, so that a long shadow of futurality obscures it. This means that the thing isn't exhausted by the relations it forms with other things, such as hands opening fridges or humans deciding on things. The hammer isn't exhausted by being hammered. It could be a landing pad for a fly, and so on. And even if not used at all, it would not be exhausted by that. Even a Muppet Hammer's interview about itself would fail to be the hammer. A Muppet Hammer's brain scan would not be the hammer. In the same way, a swim bladder can become a lung. But this isn't because there is anything lung-like about a swim bladder. It just happens that way, as Darwin argues. To be a thing is precisely to be a sort of malfunction, because there is a fundamental gap between what you are and how you appear. To be a thing at all is to be a kind of deep structural mistake, which, if you were a tragic hero, would be called hamartia, a wound. Which would be called hamartia, a wound or flaw. Things malfunction because a thing is a kind of malfunction. Malfunctioning, then, is far from being a special thing that humans notice. Malfunctioning is a deep fact about reality. Malfunctioning is ontologically underneath functioning. Or better, functioning is just a special kind of malfunctioning that we do not mark as such. A rare form of malfunctioning, as Nietzsche might put it, that somehow we did not pay enough attention to. That is environmentality, which is why environmentality is weird, disturbing, funny, or a little bit creepy. Something is going wrong. Something is malfunctioning. When you start to include the background, it doesn't mean that everything is foreground. It means that the foreground also melts, because the distinction of background and foreground starts to malfunction. The concept nature, I capitalize it to denature it, distinguishes between what is inside and what is outside human social, psychic, and philosophical space. When you drop that concept, it is not that everything becomes a human construct. It is rather that everything becomes weird and spectral. Spectral. Since social, psychic, and philosophical space can no longer be determined to be exclusively human. The environmental poem becomes more uncertain, more anxiety-provoking. Thus, Hillman's first few lines are profoundly ambiguous. How do you say Holiday Inn? Do you whisper it because it's gray? Do you pronounce the space at the end of the phrase? And if so, how? Or can you just ignore Holiday Inn until you read the black column? Then you can see that the gray text is like receipts in your pocket after you bent all those Motel 6s with their fake leather, and so on. Or perhaps it's not one sequence, but little chunks of lots of sequences. You find that you can't reduce all the uncertainty all the time. In fact, you find that the uncertainty explodes. Environmentality is malfunctioning, and a poem's environmentality is about how it malfunctioned at that weird twisted interface between semiotic and physical. The desire to reduce the uncertainty blocks environmentality. Consider this dilemma in terms visual art. Much minimal and conceptual work is preoccupied with where the art begins and where the non-art stops. It's a question of frames. An embarrassing experience of realizing that I was a Philistine happened at the Tate Modern in 2006. This had to do with encountering an empty room. At the entrance to the gallery were strewn tools for art, such as pots and paint. Paints and pot. Such as paint and pots. I assumed it was an unfinished room to which the public somehow, probably by mistake, had access. The janitor had thought the same as me. Oh, look at this bunch of brushes, and cleared them away. A fact that made it into the paper the following day. I had blown it. I had malfunctioned as a good reader of contemporary art. Realized that the Tate Modern has a condom-like attitude towards modern art, hence all the arrows that point to the art with labels that say things like, "This is art, this is good," so Philistines don't get confused. Despite all the warnings not to malfunction, I still did it. I really enjoyed it. So far, I've outlined a simple way of thinking about environmentality. We could redescribe this version of environmentality as playing with 1 plus n malfunctioning entities, tropes, or figures of speech, such that malfunctioning starts to eat into the idea of smoothness, or that anything was functioning at all. The idea of smoothness was always an illusion. A consequence of this definition is that nature really is not environmentality. Nature, if it exists, is a smoothly functioning thing, spontaneously happening outside of social space, just there, so I don't have to worry about it. In a sense, it has to do with the history of unexamined automation. It is, in other words, a completely wrong idea, not just an old idea that is no longer working. Nature is a malfunctioning concept, a condition whose malfunctioning has been erased, and whose erasure has also been erased, such that one doesn't know whether there is a malfunction or not. Environmentality is always about 1 plus n malfunction of some organon, a sparrow, a line of verse, an expectation about a line of verse, or what have you. The environment includes everything, including ideas about itself. The biosphere depends on the magnetic shield around the Earth. The sun is therefore also part of it. The solar system is therefore also part of it, and so on. There's no real edge and no real center, just like in one of those works consisting in a pile of paint and brushes. While there is an infinite regress outward into the universe when it comes to thinking environmentality, there's also a potential infinite regress inward into the components that make up an individual life form. Legs, lungs, and brains, for instance, or mitochondria and chloroplasts, are all components that act as deciders for other components. And individual frogs can form choruses of frogs, fish can form shoals, and so on. Shoals and choruses are also entities in their own right. They are malfunctioning tools whose weird being subtends their functioning and relating. Indeed, there are many ecological beings such as meadow, forest, and biosphere that are collections of things to which they cannot be reduced, yet in such a way that they are unique, specific entities. So, wherever we look, we have weird sets of things whose members do not behave very well, if you like sets of things not to contradict. There are, for instance, more parts than wholes, a state of affairs well imagined by Zizek when he talks about the idea of organs without bodies. Whether this is part of logic or not, whether ecological beings are alogical, in other words, is the question. I claim that ecological beings are perfectly logical, insofar as it is actually quite logical to accept that some things can contradict and yet remain true. In fact, this is a way to avoid the escalating war between sentences such as "this sentence is false," which is true and false at the same time, and attempts to contain them via metalinguistic rules, via Tarski. Briefly, Gödel showed that any logical system must be able to talk nonsense as a possibility condition for it being true and valid on its own terms. This was despite Russell and Whitehead's attempts to contain the contradictoriness of Cantor's infinite sets. I argue that we can extend this reasoning to any system at all, such as a life form. All beings, as a possibility condition for existing, contain a flaw. Ecological beings, such as penguin and coral, contain other beings, such as viral DNA code and stomach bacteria. We also know, since Darwin, that they are made from other beings. If we like these beings and want them to exist in some sense, we had better accept that they are fuzzy sets of things that contain things that are not members of them. Russell's nightmare. Environmentality is very thought-provoking. That is how it first occurs to people. It starts perhaps in poetry, at least with Wordsworth's breakdown of sentimental poetics. This results in the kind of illuminating opacity that make up the encounters with strangers that Wordsworth poems are so frequently about. Let's get technical about what it would mean to include the other in my ethical political decision piece. It's not going to be warm, fuzzy sympathy with a known or knowable being to be pitied. There is a feeling of uncertainty in the small print. So when I encounter these weird discharged soldiers and mentally disabled boys and so on, I feel an uncertainty. I'm not sure how to act. Part of how I disport myself is that I'm not sure. Okay. Mastery could superficially mean knowing how the tool functions so well that I don't have to think about it. This is the sort of mastery that is admired in Hamlet, where the just do it maxim of revenge is what stymies the protagonist. Yet mastery could also be about realizing that functioning is a special kind of malfunctioning to which I'm not attending enough. So, mastery could be allowing things to malfunction. Think about being a teacher. At some point, you stop trying to make the students like you. Then this feeling changes into something a bit more radical still, sort of, how badly can I teach and the class still works? You try to not teach. In a way, this is actually higher up than trying to be a teacher. Not with aggression, of course, not uncaring about the class, not how much can I get away with, but a strange kind of acceptance. You don't know that about yourself as a teacher until you've done it. It's not even learning from your mistakes. It's more like one continuous error, or as they say in Zen, shoshaka jushaku. Returning to Miles Davis, he allows the breath to malfunction in the trumpet, which is why it's so beautiful and so contemplative. There is a listening quality. He is allowing the trumpet to fuck itself up. Now consider a poem by John Ashbery, Cidre, which is much less explicitly about malfunctioning. Hasn't the sky returned from moving the other? Authority recently dropped, rested as much of, that severe sunshine as you need now on the way. You go. The reason why it happened only since you woke up is letting the steam disappear from those clouds when the landscape all around is hilly sights that will have to be reckoned into the total for there to be more air, that is, more fitness read into the undeduced result than land. This means never getting any closer to the basic principle operating behind it than to the distracted entity of a mirage, the half-meant, half-perceived motions of fronds out of the idle depths that are summer. There's a strange quality of smoothness. That's why it's hard to read. Each sentence makes a lot of sense in one way, then you realize it doesn't make any sense at all. There is a kind of malfunctioning from the very beginning. Hasn't the sky? As you read it, you think to yourself, how many invisible lines were there such that this is the opening question? Is this even line 1? The poem has already malfunctioned before you even started reading. A clepsydra is a physical device for telling the time, old enough and weird enough to force you to see that time isn't just something that happens in watches or clocks. It means water thief, since it involves droplets of water falling. The poem wants me to think that it is a clepsydra, an old device that I can't help see as a malfunctioning machine for telling the time. This brings up the idea that time doesn't happen objectively. Clocks are also tools that malfunction. The tick-tock of clockwork is a kind of constant breakage that usefully shows me what time it is. And time itself is not smooth.